The next part of the chat client is this chat server class, which handles the connection to the chat server for the client. And it's set up the same way as the chat connector. It's a chat server class that extends event emitter, takes the name of the user in the constructor, goes ahead and calls the constructor for event emitter, and then stores the name as a property on the object, makes a new socket, which is stored as a property, creates a line-oriented interface around the socket, and then it responds to line messages from the socket. So this is all pretty similar to what we did on the chat server demo. When it gets a line from the server, it goes ahead and turns it into a JavaScript object, looks at the type of the message, and handles joins, posts, and leaves slightly differently. When the chat server gets a join message from the when the chat server object gets a join message from the chat server, it emits a join event, which the connector responds to, and then the connector notifies the UI that there was a join event. Same with a post and same with a leave. Here's where we connect the socket to the backend web server. We're waiting for lines we saw, end event, in which case we disconnect and emit an end event, which causes the client to exit. We're looking for an error condition from the web server, from the chat server, which will also cause us to end. And then we're also writing a join message to the server. So when we make a new chat server object, the last thing it does when we build it is to tell the server that a new client has joined. And it passes in the user's name. So this chat server object exposes two methods. There's a post method where you can send it a line of text, and it will go ahead and turn that into a post message, which is sent to the server. And you can also tell it to close, which is going to go ahead and tell the server that you're leaving, and then it will emit the end event. So that's all pretty straightforward. The last bit is this UI, and the UI is fairly complicated, and I considered whether to make you follow along with a set of demo videos when I actually built the UI or not. But you don't need it to do the assignment this week. You don't actually need to know anything about Blest or about UIs to build the assignment this week. So I decided not to spend time on all the details. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how this thing is put together. And in the next video, I'll talk specifically about what your assignment is, but it doesn't involve writing user interface. So the chat UI is once again a class that extends event emitter. In the constructor, it calls a bunch of helper functions. First, it calls the constructor for event emitter. Then there's a function or a method that builds the UI in Blest. There's a method that attaches event listeners to the chat connector so that it can respond to events from the connector. It gets the user's name. It shows the custom form that asks the user to enter their name. And then there's a listener that responds to that. And then it sits and it listens for you to type in messages into the input box at the bottom of the form. It finishes by focusing input on the input box and by drawing the screen, drawing the GUI on the screen. There's a helper function for formatting the date, just like in the demo program. This is a little different. So in Blest, you have widgets, like there can be an input box, which is called a text box in Blest. And you make a text box, and then the text box is an event emitter. So if somebody types text into the text box in a blessed interface, you get these key events on the box that you're typing into. And so here's a key listener that's waiting for either escape or control C. And when it gets that, it calls exit. There's also a key event listener for enter, which means that the user's typed in their name and hit enter. And then what we do is we store that on our UI object. We hide the form that we use to get the name. We show the main form that we use to display the messages and also get the input for the chat. And then we focus on the input box. Finally, we tell the chat connector that we got a name event and we pass in the user's name. So let's look at that. So I'm going to run the client. So here I'm focused on the name input, and I'm showing the name input box form. When I type my name and hit return, it hides the name box, and then it shows the main input box. So this is the text area, and this is the text input. There's also a handle input method. So this is going to handle the input that I type into this box here. And I'm looking for a couple of different things. So the first thing I'm looking for is either escape or control C, and that causes the UI to emit an end event, which then the connector uses to tell the chat server object that we're done. That causes a leave message to be generated. We're also waiting for up arrow, down arrow, page up or page down. So let me type some text, and the more I add, the more lines there are. Okay, so as I was typing that, I got a scroll bar. And this doesn't respond to mouse events, unfortunately, but it does work with the keyboard. So what I can do is I can use up arrow to move up one line, and I can use down arrow to move down one line. And then page up moves up half a screen, and page down moves down half a screen. So this is the code for doing that. And this up, down, page up, page down. I also respond to the enter key being pressed by getting the value that the user typed into the input box and emitting that in a post event. Then I clear the input box and then focus back on it. So line disappears from the input and is sent as a post message to the connector. The connector uses it to call the post method on the chat server object, which sends it to the server. The server gets it and then broadcasts it to all the chat clients. So it comes back to the client chat server object, which is then passed back to the connector. And then the connector hands it back to the user interface, where it gets displayed in this pane. So this piece of text here actually makes a full round trip all the way over to the server and then back before it appears here. Woo. Okay. Pretty quick though, because it's a small packet and because it's running on this machine. Then there's a handle server method, which responds to the connector join message, post message, and leave messages. They are just basically exactly the same as what we saw in the demo version in the lecture videos, except that Blessed supports funky text highlighting and coloring, just like spans in HTML. You can define a span here in your text. And here's like a secret feature. I can type this in and then purple foreground. Oops. Purple foreground, purple. And then I'm going to end the purple foreground. Let's try red. Okay, so that worked. So apparently it doesn't know the name purple. There's a fairly limited set of colors that work with the Windows command shell. This might actually work on your system if you're running Linux and possibly Mac. But for the colors it knows, I can go ahead and do that. I can also do, bold. Which doesn't look any different. But let's try this. Green foreground, green text in bold. And then I'm going to close all of my little brackets. Yeah. So you see that the green text shows up in sort of a dim green, but when I bold it, it becomes brighter. And I think there are a couple of others. I think underline is supported. So underline slash underline. Okay, so underline works. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can go ahead and read the Blessed documentation, which I have linked in the readings for this week. So that's the only thing that's different, is that I'm based on whether the name of the user in the chat client matches the name that's tagged in the message. It will either use green if it's the same person or yellow if it's somebody else. And then if it's a system message for either a join or a leave, it goes ahead and uses the name system and tags that in red. So here's just a helper function for taking a line and adding a new line to it and then posting it to the output box. So here's the messy thing, which is the main reason I'm not actually walking you through this whole thing. So this is the function that builds the Blessed UI. And the first thing I do is I make a screen object, a Blessed screen, and all of the constructors for these widgets take the same format. It uses these option object pattern. So you give it an object with whatever set of properties you want to specify. And most of these properties are optional, and there are a bunch more properties as well. So for the screen, I decided to use auto padding, and then these settings affect basically efficiency when it does drawing. Dock borders is the thing that lets, so this is a box with a border here, and this is a text area with a border here, and dock borders attaches them on the single line. If I didn't dock borders, there would be a gap between the two boxes. And then I set the foreground color, background color, and I do some styling on the cursor. Mainly I'm using artificial because I don't like the way the cursor works, particularly on Windows. And this isn't perfect either, but it's closer. And then inside of the screen, I have a chat box object that takes up the whole screen with 100%, height 100%. It starts out hidden, which means that it's not being shown, and that's going to be the box that ends up being this whole interface. So under the chat box is the text area, this dot output, and this tags true here. That's the thing that lets me use the colors in the text and the styling, bold and underlined. That's because tags is true. If If it was false, it would just show the text. I've given a line type border to the text area. It doesn't take input. It starts top 0, left 0, so all the way jammed up at the top left. The height is 100% of the screen height minus 2 lines, which I need for the input box at the bottom. Width is 100%. And then some styling for the scroll bar. I'm using a background color of blue for this for the thumb. This thing here is the thumb, and then I'm using cyan for the track, which is the whole thing. So that's the text area. Here's the input box. It's also a child of the chat box. It's got this one is named input. It does take input, and it takes keys. Top is going to be 100% of the screen minus 3 lines, so that it bumps up against the bottom of the text area. It starts at 0. The top is 100% minus 3 lines, and then the height is 3. So that's what causes it to fill the bottom 3 lines. 1 line each for the border and 1 line for the text area. So 100% wide, takes input on focus, border is a line, and then style the foreground and background color, as well as when it has focus. Then we come to the name box, and that's the thing we see at the very beginning. So if I hit escape here and run it again, so this thing is the name box. And it's a parent of screen. It starts out visible. So the other one is hidden and this one is visible. It's got a name. It's got a top and left, which are centered. So the top and left are centered. It takes tags for colored text. The width is a fixed width and a fixed height, 35 characters by 13 characters. Here's the content, and I've used tags to mark it up. It's got a line border, and then inside of the box, I have this name input, which is a text box, and that's this thing here at the bottom. So it's a child of name box, pretty much the same stuff we've seen. It takes input, takes keys. The top is 5 characters up from the bottom of the name box. The left is centered, and then height is 3 characters for 2 border and a text line. Width is -4, just so that you get a little padding on each side, so it's standing out as a box. And then it's styled with foreground and background color. And that's everything for the user interface. So basically, the name box starts visible and the chat box starts hidden. And then when I get input from the user, that results in a name event with the user's name. And then I hide this box, and then I show the chat interface. So that should be everything you need if you want to actually look through this code in more detail and look at the blessed documentation. And in the last video, I'll go ahead and talk about the assignment for this week.